Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the final session of CUPA Con Day 1. So in this last hour, who better to have on stage than two biostatisticians to wrap up the day? So we're going to have an engaging and dynamic conversation on real-world data collected from expanded access programs and real-world evidence generation. All right, excellent. And then we also have Mahnu, who will introduce shortly. So first, introduction. So my name is Hayley Belli. I am an assistant professor here in the Division of Biostatistics at NYU Langone Health. I'm a member of NYU Division of Medical Ethics CUPA, as well as I co-lead the Ethics and Real World Evidence subgroup. My research interests are in the design, conduct, and analysis of pragmatic clinical trials, as well as adaptive clinical trials. And thus, I'm very interested in data collected from real-world data sources, as well as expanded access programs and how we can use those to supplement our clinical trials. So I'd like to introduce our two additional members of this panel. So first, Mahnu, who we have on the screen, who's joining us from DC. Mahnu Davar is a partner at Arnold & Porter, and he co-chairs the Life Sciences and Healthcare Regulatory Practice and works closely with fellow lawyers, compliance officers, regulatory professionals, and business executives across the life sciences industry. Mahnu counsels clients on mission-critical FDA, CLIA, fraud and abuse, and state licensing regulatory matters, and he routinely assists multinational companies with product quality and safety issues. He also frequently assists medical technology and diagnostics clients with product classification, clearance, approval, and commercial strategy issues. He also is an adjunct professor at Penn Law School. Next, our second speaker is Tobias Polak, who received his PhD from Erasmus University, Rotterdam, where his doctoral dissertation focused on expanded access, compassionate use, and real-world data collection. He has published numerous articles in the field in high-impact journals, and we're going to hear about a ton of that work today. Some of these journals he's published in are including, but not limited to, JAMA, the American Journal of Bioethics, the Lancet, and the British Medical Journal. He also is a statistician by training and has both academic and industry experience, having worked many years for the organization My Tomorrows and consulting for Bain & Company. So to kick off this conversation, I'm first going to give an introduction to help us set the stage. And then we're going to have a dynamic presentation where we pose to you a bunch of questions and then slowly work our way through them. And so we'll reserve at the very end about 15 minutes for Q&A. So hang on to your questions as we pose questions to you throughout. So to kick off this conversation, I would like us to first reflect on how data collection from expanded access programs even arises. So we know that expanded access enables patients with an unmet medical need to gain access to an unapproved medical product when they are unable to enter a clinical trial. So it's important to be reminded that expanded access is intended as treatment first, not research. So expanded access for a patient really begins with the clinician, and there isn't a sponsor reviewing at the start. So for single patient expanded access, we have one patient and one treating clinician. However, for, say, cohort expanded access, you can see it starts to look like, say, an open label, single arm trial, with the main difference being minimal inclusion-exclusion criteria and the primary intent of providing access to the investigational product rather than research. So meanwhile, we know that randomized controlled trials serve as our gold standard for evidence. But since the 21st Century Cures Act was passed in 2016, there's been a strong recommendation and call for the use of real-world data. So here, real-world data we're discussing is anything derived outside of randomized controlled trials. And so there's been a call to basically support regulatory decision-making using that real-world data. So real-world data alone cannot replace RCTs. However, given limitations of RCTs, like we've discussed today, from recruitment to stringent inclusion-exclusion criteria, small sample sizes and rare diseases, you name it, there is definitely an opportunity to use real-world data collected from expanded access programs to supplement RCTs. Yet, while there's an opportunity, we also acknowledge that there is a limitation and that these data may not be and often are not held to the same robust data collection and quality methods as RCTs or even observational studies where, again, the primary objective is research, not treatment. So that all said, there has been an uprise recently in expanded access data collection. And so here, so I guess if we could cue the slides, or do we control them? Here we go. Excellent. And I guess I should have mentioned we don't have any COIs and all of our views are our own. But here, if you see this figure, which Dr. Polak next to me will dive into further since I'm here citing his work. But as you can see, there has been an uprise in expanded access data collection. And so from this figure here, we can see that both the FDA and EMA relied on data from expanded access programs that were deemed either pivotal or supportive of the clinical efficacy profile. So there has been a recent increase in the biopharmaceutical industry being interested in collecting real-world data from expanded access, and regulators have been increasingly willing to consider these data as part of the regulatory submission. So with all that in mind, today we'll be discussing the value of these data quality issues, and whether or when we can trust real-world data collected from expanded access programs. So I had mentioned at the start, I will be posing several questions to our speakers today to help guide this discussion on this very topic. And I will begin with the first question. So, why are some data better than other data? And so specifically, what are some of the characteristics or features that we look for? And how do we know whether we can trust data from expanded access programs? So I'll turn the mic over to Tobias, and then we'll hear from Mahnu afterwards.
Yes, so I did prepare some slides for that one, as I was expecting that question, because I think it might first be good to dive a bit into the research on how, for example, researchers or how payer bodies or how FDA and or EMA have been using data from expanded access programs in their appraisals. If my slides appear or somewhere, yeah. If you go to the next, I can do it myself, I guess. Right. Yeah. So I think one of my main sort of questions when I started that research was finding out who are actually using data from expanded access programs. So is it primarily researchers, or clinicians, or pharmaceutical researchers? Is it more payer institutions such as the National Institute of Care and Excellence in the UK, or are regulatory bodies actually primarily using data from expanded access programs? And if they are using those data, in what form and shape? So how to figure that out? Well, we wrote a couple of scripts to simply scrape all the documents from publicly available websites. So I think 150,000 different documents covering more than 8,000 drugs, I guess. And we searched them for terms related to expanded access. So compassionate use, pre-approval access, managed access, single patient IND, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What we did subsequently is we only investigated, obviously, the documents where such a term was present. So we could get rid of the vast majority of documents, and we didn't have to read through them all. Still left, I think, 12,000 documents to be left assessed by a team. And then we looked at whether the term expanded access was actually relevant to what we here consider as expanded access, right? It might be that a document contained, I don't know, patient A expanded access to indication B, and then we were not talking about expanded access as we were using it in this conference. So we determined first the relevancy of that term, and subsequently we created a sort of database at My Tomorrow's with the name of the drug, the company, how many patients there were in that program, what the methodology of the study was, whether it was multinational or just in a single country, and from that database we could extract all kinds of different results. For example, we concluded that if you look over time, there's a clear increase in the use of expanded access by researchers. Obviously, that goes fast. Obviously, expanded access is primarily in onco and hematology, and a bit less so in other disease areas. Of course, that uprise is in part caused by COVID. And you see also that the distribution of research the research is not equally distributed, of course, over the geographies. What we also saw was that NICE, so actually payer bodies, use data from expanded access programs in 20% of their decisions. That's quite a lot. They could use these data for various purposes and in varying degrees of, I think, reliability. But the fact that they use these data, I think, really caused a sort of a shift in the thinking of expanded access and data generation. Because I remember when I sort of started this research, people were saying that you could not collect data, or data would not be accepted, or it's only been done a couple of times. But actually, prior to this conference, there already was quite a systematic collection of data. And similar holds for the FDA and EMA usage of expanded access data in their filings. So the figure you just saw was actually from 2018, I think. And these are updated data because my colleagues at My Tomorrow's are still working on updating these data year by year. So that's a bit of the background in the research behind the usage of expanded access data. And I think that was it for my slides. Yeah.
All right. Making sure you can still hear me, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Feels quiet. So I guess kind of building, so I'll ask you a couple of questions, Tobias, then I'll ask Mahnu a few questions. So I said my introduction, we're viewing expanded access more as treatment or as research. Can you kind of discuss your views on this, Tobias, in terms of, how do you view it and the role that it might aid in research?
Yeah, so I think of it a bit as a false dichotomy, right? Why should I choose between either, or why can't I have both? Because why can't a data set that was originally intended as providing treatment not also serve as a means to conduct research? So that's how, retrospective research of medical records is exactly the same idea. I think from a patient perspective, however, which makes expanded access a bit different, is that in the case of high burden of disease, then patients are looking primarily for treatment, right? They don't actually care that much about the ethical distinction we make between something treatment or research. There might be a couple of patients that purely altruistically partake in clinical trials, but the majority, especially in the expanded access case, probably does so because of the chance of obtaining treatment. So I think that the dichotomy simply doesn't really work that well in the expanded access setting.
Yeah. And so what would make a treatment expanded access program more or less fit for research? What are some of those specific aspects?
Yeah, so I'll cover, I think, a couple of examples later.
Okay, yeah.
We don't know that yet. But I think how can you make it more research than only treatment? I think you could already start by simply following the sort of real-world evidence guidelines that the FDA or the EMA has put forth, right? How do you make sure that data is more reliable? Well, it's not rocket science in that sense, right? You do something prospectively, do something systematically, think beforehand what kind of biases will appear in you might appear in your data. Think beforehand of what data quality issues you might see, because that's in the end the main problem with retrospective research, is that you don't get the chance to repair that after the fact.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. All right, so turning to Mahnu, who is joining us live from DC. Mahnu, what do you have to add on this topic of why are some data better than other data? And specifically, you're a lawyer, so, talk about from a regulatory standpoint, kind of some of the things we should be considering.
Sure. So, I mean, just to build on Tobias's point about control of data, I do think that, at least from an FDA's case, what the agency really looks at is the reliability and relevance of the data, right? So you don't always know necessarily if you're a sponsor of a single patient treatment IND, or even if you're a pharma company and you're expanding access through intermediate use, that you intend to use that data for regulatory submission, right? I mean, I think for a lot of us, a lot of companies, a lot of physicians out there, they're going into it on a patient by patient basis for the therapeutic value to open up a study or open up an avenue for somebody to get care. And so I think that does lead to some challenges, though, in design, because I think, at least in my experience, a lot of the studies that have been used for confirmatory evidence often are done after the fact, right? It's like in the course of enrolling, you realize, if we follow these patients where the benefit outweighs the risk and they may be getting some therapeutic benefit, and we use that positive safety data to submit to the FDA to support a submission, that may have some value. And I think so there becomes a very practical challenge, right? Because you may not be designing this as a prospective study with everybody in mind. You may be thinking about these kinds of issues after the study's already started. So, I mean, I think there is a pragmatic reality to how these things are being set up in terms of reliability, right? The hallmarks of well control just may not be there. I think both for reliability and for relevance, it's also really critical to think about what are the endpoints, what's the data points that are being collected, right? So if you have patient-reported outcomes in a study where the patient is going in being told that, while this may be their last and best or only treatment option, it is treatment, there's a chance that they're going to respond to questions about safety or therapeutic benefit differently than if they're told that they were on, an experimental control arm, right? And that's part of the change from equipoise into the world of expanded access. So I think those features are inherent in expanded access programs, and it's something that we need to take into account. I think, regulators are learning how to deal with those things. There's incentives and interest in working with sponsors to use confirmatory evidence. My favorite example I pick is Lutathera is one example where there's confirmatory evidence from an EAP. But, when you take the real world evidence aspect of this and combine it with the treatment use aspect, I do think you can run into some challenges as to whether that data is reliable enough, especially to use as a primary data source to support efficacy. So I don't know. I mean, I'm not a biostatistician. So you said we're going to wrap the program with 2 statisticians. The only thing that maybe is duller is talking to a lawyer. So I'm going to throw it back to both of you, because I think you both can have a robust discussion about kind of what are the features from a statistical control standpoint, because I think at the end of the day, that matters more. I mean, you can think about things like whether somebody has proper informed consent. You can think about the way a protocol is designed. But at the end of the day, if you can use the data or not, it's going to turn on whether it's robust, right? Is it statistically significant to support what you're trying to do?
Thank you. I will add, it warmed my heart as a statistician that you focused on endpoints, because I think that's kind of one of the #1 aspects, at least from statistical profile, that is often forgotten about. Because I think we think about RCTs as, oh, okay, what gives you that causal inference is the fact that we have, randomization or, but it's like we forget that's like, well, if you're measuring in one patient endpoint at 6 months and another patient endpoint in 1 year, that could have significant consequences. Broadly, though, as Mahnu kind of led us to, we have all these statistical considerations, the big one being population representation. And so, we know that RCTs have these limitations of inclusion-exclusion criteria. I personally am very passionate about pragmatic RCTs, so trying to lessen some of that inclusion-exclusion criteria and getting at real-world evidence in that way. But this is also an opportunity to bring in the supplemental real-world data. And then also, Mahnu brought up in terms of reliability of data, we have to think about, the quality of these data, literally how accurate are they? How complete are they? What is the timeliness of this data, and then also just like the relevance. So is it available, sufficient, representative? We talked about. But I always say that, what we can use real world data for in an RCT, we often try to focus on, oh man, what is the primary outcome? But really the role of real world data can come with all these supplementary outcomes or secondary or exploratory analyses. And so we can think of real world data as maybe hypothesis generating for the RCT that we maybe will have in the future. It can impact the design of the RCT. We really have no reservations of it providing safety data, so getting that kind of profile. But then, of course, we always need to think about rare diseases where, you're going to have challenges with these clinical trials. And so the real world data from an expanded access program is very valuable there. So yeah, do you have anything? You grabbed the mic, so I was wondering if you had something to add to Go ahead.
I was also triggered because in the end, whether it's using expanded access data or whether it's using a single arm trial versus a randomized controlled experiment, in the end, it all boils down, of course, to the sort of the unease of the possibility of allowing a drug on the market that might not work, which of course is the type 1 error, as nerds would say. Because we also know, of course, that in the current system, we deliberately do not also reject drugs that are actually effective, right? The other side of the coin. So I think it would be wise, of course, to be a bit more flexible in terms of allowing drugs or not, whether it's expanded access data or not, to just factor in the burden of the disease rather than to just stare at, I don't know, a 5% significance level or not, or a certain potential inflation of type 1 error. But maybe that's too much statistics for
we're losing
pre-drink. Yeah, I know.
But I think if I can just chime in, I think though this idea about type 1 error is absolutely critical to the way that regulators are starting to look at the way that companies use this data, for example, even in marketing and education purposes, right? So as FDA has accepted, for example, multiple endpoint clinical trial submissions, right? There's a whole, FDA's guidance about this as a whole background table that has stuff that's known well to the both of you on how to control for error, how to do prospective control, right? With things like alpha allocation programs and that kind of thing. So, I think this is a real concern. And I think, I would just go back to the point of not all real world data are collected alike and perform alike, as you both have pointed out. And I think they become even more, I would say, interesting and in some cases suspect if the data is taken from the context of an EAP. Because again, there's a question in the chat earlier about what do we mean by real world data in this context? It's a really good question, because somebody who's enrolling in an expanded access program, while they may have liberal inclusion criteria, they still have to go through the ICF process. They still have to go through a process where they're talking about risk benefit in a way that, I don't think necessarily feels and looks the same from a patient standpoint as somebody who's facing ordinary treatment, right? And so just that creates a barrier or an artificialness to the way that people are thinking about their involvement, which could reflect or resonate on the way that they report out data, both the physician supervising the study or the sponsor or the patient.
If I can admit, actually, that because I studied that real world data like for 4 years, and the more I study it, the more annoying I became with the term, actually, because it's such a consulting term. So I'm also like, of course, a consulting, but you can sort of fight real world data, right? Who prefers to have fake world data or something like that? Or you can't. The success of that term is sort of is fueled by the fear of the antonym, right? Who wants imprecise medicine? Who wants untargeted drugs? But what do you exactly mean with real world data, right? We just had observational studies long ago, and now we call it real world data, but it's still the same stuff, actually. Yeah. So I call it EAP data now, moving forward.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree with that. As a statistician, I think when we first started hearing the term real world data, I too had the same reaction. I was like, so it's an observational study. But yeah, obviously the term has evolved. And so now we're kind of thinking about, what does this term mean in present day? So, all right, I think we can move to our second question. So we've kind of segued into this because we started discussing some of the cons to expanded access program data. But our question now is, what are some downsides to expanded access program data collection? So I'll turn to Tobias again and then Mahnu.
Yeah. So I think again here, the main problem here, or the main issue is the expectation you have up front, right? If you expect to gather sort of a randomized controlled trial like quality data, then you will be disappointed in the end. But we have shown in our research that for some cases, right, for payer purposes, for additional safety data, potentially for trial adjacent populations slightly, EAP data can actually be effective. And I think it's also a lot to ask for an expanded access program to replace an RCT, whereas 5 years ago we were saying you cannot even collect any data, right? So I think that's a big jump.
Do you have anything to add, Mahnu?
No, I think it's a fair point. I think there's this tension, right, that's been slowly unwinding, or whatever the right word is, as to whether you can ever use real-world data for anything more than confirmatory evidence. But I think when it comes to expanded access programs, some of the limitations we talked about, I think, can make that difficult. You can all imagine, folks in the audience can imagine, exceptions to that. But I think that given some of the challenging circumstances under which expanded access programs happen, particularly single patient INDs, I think there are real and important questions that would be asked by regulators about, the reliability of that data. I think, safety information continues to be, and confirmatory safety information continues to be something that I think is a bright spot here. I mean, there's obviously other examples where EAP programs have been used to confirm efficacy. But, I think for EAP programs, until a product is approved, when folks are on it for a while for conditions that allow them to continue on it, you do have maybe a longer term data set in some cases than you would in a clinical study protocol. And there's pros and cons to that, obviously, about the game of the regulatory strategy of how's your risk benefit going to look if you include a longer, more open data set. The FDA is concerned about kind of things that are very technical, which may not be of as much interest to this audience, but things like, the integrity of the data. Is it being collected and put in a Part 11 compliant database? Is there adequate kind of risk-based monitoring of these kinds of studies? We don't think of them as studies, but if you're going to put in the information in a submission, ostensibly somebody's going to have to certify that the information is accurate and truthful. So is a sponsor going to be able to do that? Sponsor going to be able to rely on the physicians who collect that information in the same way? So, I mean, those are some very real things that and very present things that sponsors are thinking about in this space. But I do think there is a lot of opportunity here, and we see in Tobias's data, I've seen other numbers as well, that there's many more FDA submissions that have a real-world evidence component, including in some cases an EAP component. So companies are finding a way to do this with doctors and patients.
And then I'll add actually on Mahnu's point that this idea that, okay, when we're doing an RCT especially, or even observational studies, especially as a statistician, we have to put together a statistical analysis plan, a data management plan, pre-specify all the exploratory, secondary, primary outcomes, what order we're going to do them in. These are aspects that make the data and the study robust. And so suddenly with expanded access program data, you don't have all those documents. And so I've often thought, why can't we have some hybrid transition where it's like, okay, expanded access is intended for treatment, but if we're going to collect data that could potentially be used in any capacity for research, why not call upon some kind of protocol for like, well, what are we going to do with that data? And it kind of helps frame going into it. Okay, like, well, what kind of analyses are we thinking of doing, or what might we use this data for? And, it can only help, right? Because it just makes you think about, what you need from that data set and kind of thinking about what you could potentially use, and perhaps along the way, maybe what you should be collecting, because anytime something's planned, I think we can argue that probably leads to a better outcome. So, but yeah.
Yeah. I must say, I've in the programs that I've worked on, and also with the agency, we always made like a sort of lightweight, stripped down version of an statistical analysis plan, of course, like based on the trial, but then just trim it down to make it fit for expanded access. So not entirely, well, I mean, in the end, that is just research, but sort of lightweight research compared to what you get in a trial. Yeah.
Yeah. Excellent.
And I would just add one other
any-
point there, if you don't mind, which is we're talking a lot about the reliability part, but there's also the relevance part, right? And I think this is an increasingly interesting conversation, both from a regulatory strategy standpoint and a trial ethics standpoint, which is the population from whom you're collecting data, particularly in rare disease and particularly in an EAP, going to be representative of the kinds of people who are going to have access to the product afterwards, right? So in a conventional trial now, FDA expects end of phase 2 to have a diversity action plan, for example, submitted, right, out of this concern that research should be done in populations that represent the populations who are going to benefit from the drug when it's on the market. And I think that's always challenging in rare disease. There's all kinds of questions about access to medicines, and many of the folks in the audience here are doing excellent work to try to meet those challenges. I think those challenges just multiply when you come to EAPs, because you wonder who are the folks that are going to have access to these programs, who's going to become aware of these programs. Obviously, there's been a tremendous amount of work done by the patient advocacy community to get folks, get these programs known to people, but there's still going to be limitations to that, particularly for small programs. And I think that's something that, should continue to be considered, and I think regulators worldwide will continue to consider.
All right. Excellent. All right. I think that's a good segue now into our third question. So, what are some examples of success or failure stories in expanded access program data collection? Have you seen more treatment and research, expanded access program data collection projects? So I'll let Tobias walk us through some examples here.
Yeah, thanks. So before I get into good or bad or success or failure, maybe start with let's start with an expanded access program that's more treatment, perhaps, and then with one that's more research. So the first example that I worked on, and both cases are published, so I'm happy free to talk about all of this, is a pratelivir, which is a treatment for, this is being developed for treatment-resistant herpes. So not your typical oncology or hematology product, of course. It's a tablet form, and patients suffer from, of course, lesions, herpes lesions. In our expanded access program, we actually set up a data collection that also measured sort of the width and the height of the lesions and took pictures of the lesions taken by the physicians to measure the potential effectiveness of the drug. The drug was just taken orally by us. So it was an easy drug. So I think this was a very sort of real world setting. What we also directly discovered was that a lot of patients were not eligible for the trial, for example, because they were not ideal trial patients in the sense that they had to have sort of measurable lesions like a width and a height. But we also had patients who had lesions sort of around body parts that were just not measurable, and therefore wouldn't fit that idea of width times height originally. What we also had is that with herpes, of course, is that it can reoccur. But if you want to estimate the efficacy of a treatment in a non-biased way, well, if somebody already had the treatment and it worked for this patient, well, you just cannot put this patient with a reoccurrence of the herpes again in the program because they're likely, again, to benefit from that treatment. Another issue there we had was, for example, that, of course, COVID happened, so patients couldn't go to the hospital anymore, and we said those pictures had to be taken by a physician. So can we now use pictures taken by patients, for example? And how are we going to submit that safely over the internet? So that's a sort of a typical super real world case. Another drug that we worked on was tabelecleucel, which is an EMA approved drug by now. I think it's still under development at the FDA, and that's a cell therapy. So it's a highly specialized therapy. It's mainly targeting Epstein-Barr virus-driven malignancies, and that could only be administered by highly specialized centers. So only, I think, 2 sites in England could administer the drug. And there they had scans, they had all the things that they would also have within a research context. So that was an expanded access program that was completely on the research side. yeah, a single arm trial would have potentially looked slightly different, but not a lot different from what we actually did in the expanded access program and its related data collection.
Great. Anything you want to add, Mahnu, about your experiences, perhaps especially from the regulatory standpoint or, clinical efficacy profile on either success or failure stories?
The only observation I'll add, because I can't really talk about some of the examples I've worked on, but is that, in areas like oncology, for example, where you might have a primary RCT ongoing and EAPs are being used for off-label uses, it does present an interesting, it presents potential to basically take evidence from those onesie, twosie EAP programs and say, maybe we can bundle those together and support, let's say, efficacy or tolerability for certain cancer types. So I think there is something there. And I think it is encouraging that regulators are accepting some of this, particularly in oncology, for confirmatory evidence.
Yeah, no, yeah, great point. And if I can add sort of a failure rather than, because I think we've heard a lot of success stories. So if you look at the NICE appraisal from cabazitaxel in prostate cancer, those expanded access data were rejected because the patients in the expanded access program were deemed too fit compared to the trial. So we always talk about real world patients of being unfit and I don't know, more frail. But here, the expanded access program, potentially because it was a prospective program or prospective protocol set up and only, select academic centers were participating with only the best patients. In the end, that led to the data not being accepted because they had far more ECOG 1 patients than actually in the trial in the end. So it may also just be the other way around. Yeah.
All right. I think that then concludes for these 3 questions, unless there's anything you want to add, Mahnu or Tobias, before we transition to the patient perspective. All right. Okay, so we're going to end today's session by making a few comments about the patient role in expanded access programs. And then we're going to reserve some time at the end for Q&A. So we'll have an opportunity to answer your questions. So with regard to the patient perspective, we'd like to acknowledge that collectively we are 2 biostatisticians and a lawyer. So we are not experts on this topic, but nonetheless, when we gathered, the 3 of us, and we're discussing content, we felt it was important because the patient role in expanded access is huge. And we want to basically pose some questions again to you to consider about this patient perspective. So a first question that we would like to raise is, from a patient viewpoint, is there something that the patient would find problematic about their data being used from their treatment experience? So for example, obviously privacy is important, always to keep in mind. And when real world data is being collected from expanded access programs, that's being put towards drug development, the clinical efficacy profile, future publications, et cetera. And so you can imagine concern from patients, and especially if it's a rare disease where the patient's anonymity is perhaps potential to be compromised, there may be some fears there in allowing their data to be used. The second question that I want to bring up that sometimes arises is, what are patients obligated to provide when participating in expanded access programs? So for example, you could argue on one end, is it fair to indeed expect something extra? But on the other hand, would it be fair to future patients to not collect that data? So we really need to carefully consider the trade-offs here between no data collection versus data collection, and what ultimately leads to advancements in the field and potentially benefiting future patients down the road. So on one hand, you obviously have individual autonomy, but on the other hand, potential for evidence generation for a broader population. And so, of course, going back to the theme that we keep talking about, there's this trade-off between expanded access being treatment and intended for treatment, But also an RCT or observational study is intended for research. And so where are we drawing this line between where we can start moving that needle of expanded access data collection being used for research? And so we've discussed today things like data quality, of course, that we need to consider. And then it would be bad on my part to not bring up this topic of fairness and especially equity in terms of access here. So thinking about equity in terms of just allocation, proportionality in expanded access programs versus randomized controlled trials. So while the rights of trial participants are often detailed in an informed consent form in a trial or document in a study protocol, there is some potential for exploitation of patients' data collected from expanded access programs. Ideally, like we discussed, there'd be some kind of document discussing what the collection is, management outcomes, proposed statistical analyses, kind of how that data can segue from treatment to research. So these are some very high level thoughts on this topic, just to kind of, again, propose more ideas to think about from the patient perspective. Ideally, maybe in a future CUPA Con, we can actually have a patient perspective on real world data to dig into some of these topics. So one last time, I'm going to turn the mic over to Mahnu and Tobias in case you have any final thoughts to add. Doesn't have to be on the patient perspective, can just be on any of the items we discussed today or any final closing thoughts.
I mean, I think to answer your question directly about data collection, this is where the authorization from the patient and consent really matters. And I realize that it's very legalistic to think that that's on anybody's mind at the time that somebody's, accessing treatments in many cases for rare disease or where they've failed other treatments. But I think out of fairness, that is absolutely critical for a physician, for example, to share with a patient that, hey, information that's being collected here isn't just for regulatory purposes to monitor safety, but also because it's going to be shared with a commercial sponsor. I think, practically speaking, in my own experience, I don't think that's going to be necessarily the biggest challenge, but I do think that needs to be made clear. And I think that becomes challenging to a point that Tobias raised earlier about, if you're trying to collect this data after the fact, if you realize after you've already enrolled some patients or different patients have gone through this program that you want to use your data, going back to them after the fact could be difficult. And so that's why, thinking about that consent form and thinking about, the IRB review at the individual physician site level is pretty critical if you're talking about a non-emergency situation.
I think my closing thoughts would potentially be that the sort of objections against data collection in expanded access programs sometimes aren't really fair from my point of view. I mean, expanded access is no panacea, right? It's not going to solve the fact that marginalized groups cannot partake in trials sufficiently. It's not going to resolve the fact that potential trials are too stringent due to inclusion and exclusion criteria, or expanded access programs are not the cause of the lack of randomized trials. Right? So the fact that you can use data from expanded access program, that doesn't mean that I'm against randomized controlled trials. No, I'm a proponent of randomized controlled trials, and I'm a proponent of expanded access data collection.
Okay, I think that's an excellent way to close. So we're now going to open it up to Q&A. So if you have any questions, you can come up to the mics and all three of us are happy to answer.
There's a few in the chat still as well.
Oh. Excellent. Thanks, Mahnu. Looks like Kara's on it.
Hi, so my name's Kaylee. I oversee our expanded access program, but also our infectious disease clinical trial program. So I kind of on both sides. First, a quick comment, pratelivir is an awesome drug. I hope it gets approved. We've treated people both on the clinical trial and through expanded access, and the visuals from the beginning to the end are insanely cool. For patients that have suffered a long time, this drug is amazing. That aside, I'm an epidemiologist by training. And one thing that we've really struggled with is how do we use qualitative data, which is not my favorite type of data, in these EINDs, SPINDs, EAPs, because a lot of times the outcome especially for infectious diseases, and I'm sure many chronic diseases that we've talked about today, the outcome isn't black and white. There's a lot of gray area. And so how do we capture this more qualitative data when going to the FDA, when going to our hospitals to ask for funding to support these centers, things like that? What do we do with qualitative data that biostatisticians and epidemiologists don't always love?
Yeah, thanks for your question. So to stay with the Pretelivir in that case, because we did also collect some qualitative data there from the page. So I remember we made up these sort of, in this patient listings, we also had these sort of sections, sort of patient narratives that actually the doctors themselves filled out on how they thought the patient was benefiting or not benefiting from that treatment. Of course, I don't know what the exact effect was of those qualitative data, which the inherent problem, of course, with qualitative data is. But I think that if I read through those stories, those really made a compelling case for the use of Pretelivir. So you can actually collect those data in expanded access setting as well.
Yeah, and I'll add too. I mean, I love the idea of expanded access data always as hypothesis generating and kind of guiding us to the next study. And I think a lot of those qualitative data sometimes will make you realize, oh my gosh, we're not actually capturing the right outcome that matters. And you can think of things like pain or, like select different areas of therapeutics. It's like, how do you might measure some clinical biomarker, but then at the end of the day, if a patient feels better on something, how do you capture that? And so, I mean, I'm on a lot of studies that are mixed methods, and but I think you're right that there's kind of this question of we've moved forward and we're collecting the quality of data, but now it's like, okay, well, what are we actually using it for? And I think it kind of helps us kind of narrow down on our research questions, and are we actually, is the quantitative kind of aligning with what we need to collect qualitatively as well? So yeah, thanks for your question.
Hi, I'm Kathy Collett, an individual ALS advocate from Indianapolis, Indiana. I appreciate the fact that you were trying to put patient perspective into this. I think every panel should do that. But I also think that every panel should have a person actually living with the diseases in question on the panel. So I hope you will consider that for next time. Thank you.
Yes, we will. Thank you.
Hi, we have a few questions from our virtual audience. So the first is, should sponsor teams plan to include real world evidence collection as part of their EA protocol, or is it better to manage it as a separate RWD protocol, but running concurrently with the EAP? There are separate FDA guidances on both EAP and RWD / real world evidence, but they don't appear to cross-reference each other. Sorry, that was a lot of letters. I hope you got all of that.
So the
Okay. Should sponsor teams plan to include RWD is real world data collection as part of their expanded access protocol, or is it better to manage it as a separate real world data protocol, but running concurrently with the expanded access protocol? Doesn't make sense to me, but
yeah, it's fantastic that they're considering whether they should incorporate it or run it separately. So that's in the first place. But I don't think it really matters that much whether you want to, whether you incorporate in your expanded access treatment protocol. I must say though that ideally, if you're focusing more on the treatment aspect of expanded access, then you'd want your expanded access application to be as light as possible, right? So you wouldn't add a lot of information on statistical analyses, et cetera, within that. However, as the expanded access, for example, grows into a treatment IND or something, then of course it makes way more sense to also make a more elaborate protocol and include also analysis. The fact that those guidances don't reference each other, I think you should make use of both regardless.
I want to respond to what you said and pull Hayley into this. So I agree with what I'm Allison Bateman House. I'm co-chair of CUPA.
So you said it doesn't really matter whether you have a standalone RWD/E protocol or whether that's part of your expanded access protocol. And in general, I agree, logistically, but you have to think about informed consent. And so if we're saying that expanded access program is treatment, the bar for that treatment program is pretty low because our bar for treatment is pretty low unless it's something like surgery. But our bar for saying, do you want to get this drug is generally pretty low, generally. But if you are collecting data from a patient and that data collection is starting to involve measures that are beyond what would normally be part of the treatment protocol. So it's not just collecting data from the patient's chart. It's not just doing what normally would be done to track the patient's progress, but they're add-on measures. That's where I think the question comes in about, that may call for an actual research like informed consent, at which point I would argue perhaps you should separate the two and actually have that real world data collection be an actual research protocol that involves full bore informed consent. So what do you think about that? And I saw Mahnu shaking his head, so I want to know what he thinks too.
Yeah, go ahead, Mahnu.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I think the real world, at that point, the real world evidence description or moniker doesn't really do a whole lot for you, right? I mean, it's just, I would argue it's not really real world at that point, right? If you're talking about intermediate access program where a sponsor said, 30 people have been performing on this RCT, and we're going to put 20 of them on a treatment arm. We're going to amend our IND, put in a new protocol, go through IRB for that. It doesn't really feel like a real world, normal circumstances of physician-patient treatment kind of situation, given the journey that patient has taken and the physician, usually the investigator, has taken. So I think in that sense, I don't know that the real world evidence piece gets you a whole lot in terms of not just the statistical control, but also the ethical controls that you put in the study. It's basically just another place to collect data. I think if you're looking at it retrospectively, and you're trying to say something about, okay, there's evidence that's been published from 3 or 4 or 5 of these case studies, and we're going to try to bundle these things together to kind of extract from that information about, confirmatory evidence of therapeutic effect. Then it feels more like a real world evidence study, more like, a non-interventional study in that sense. But I think from what the questioner was asking, I think it's basically 2 clinical studies effectively in that point. So I think that's why you don't see the crosswalk in the FDA guidance, because I think they wouldn't ordinarily use the real world evidence moniker to describe what we're thinking about in terms of a prospective data collection through an EAP program.
Yeah, and I also think, what you were describing, Allison, is just, in my opinion, the tipping point between observational and interventional, right? When do you impose certain additional research strains that actually become that you actually intervene in the normal treatment course, right? So for example, I only know this, the Netherlands example here, but in an observational study in the Netherlands, you could draw blood from patients, you can draw additional blood from patients, but you cannot schedule a blood draw just in an observational study. You can, however, if they're already drawing blood anyways, can draw another vial of blood and still remain in the observational setting. So at some point, of course, you have to, you tip from non-interventional to interventional. I think that's exactly when it becomes a separate study, really. That being said, I don't advocate data collection for the sake of data collection. So you must always sort of weigh the additional potential evidence that you generate to the research strains that you impose on patients and physicians, of course, because someone has to enter the data. Yeah.
Yeah, I think building off of that, we say it over and over again, but data needs to be fit for purpose. And so if you're, like you said, if you're collecting data and it's like, what is it good for at the end of the day, then, you know, why are we collecting it? And so you can argue that, well, if it's moving more towards research, then it has those rigorous, robust components that make it higher quality. But yeah, it's a tough question. Yeah, go ahead.
So it seems we want to be all things to all people, right? And expanded access to me for 30 years plus, it's been about getting drugs to people who need it. And that's the goal, that's the outcome. It's making it easier for patients, making it easier for clinicians, right? Then we have randomized controlled trials. What we're talking about, when we start talking real world data, is observational studies with some sort of causal framework built around it. And we need to do all three things well, right? And mushing it all together creates a big hot mess.
Yeah.
And so I'm trying to think about how we can simplify our lives and not try to burden expanded access programs with the weight of making causal inferences, because that's what people really wanted to do. They wanted to confirm clinical benefit or to verify safety. It puts a lot of burden on patients and clinicians who simply want to get drugs to see if they save their own lives.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really valid point, that if we're kind of in the middle, you know, what are we doing? You know, it's like there's compromises. And so it's really hard. Yeah. Right.
Well, that's what makes this panel a fun thought experiment. I don't think we're advocating that this is this rounds that square, but I do think that it's worth thinking about it from the real world evidence lens, because I think as these kinds of programs, depending on the particular drug in question, do quote unquote enroll larger numbers, I think there's going to be interest in this. And I think certainly in looking at case reports from these kinds of studies retrospectively, it does raise some of these questions about whether you should consider these things, and regulators should consider these things in the category of real world with the respective lower bars that some of the commentators talked about. I think there's some benefit to that if ultimately it benefits patients and you have safe drugs that get on the market.
You may have been talking about this and I just didn't pick it up, being not a statistician at all. But Hayley, you mentioned that real world data has more value when the rarer the disease, when you have less evidence. And I agree with that. But I'm trying to, what I can't get my mind around is how you consider that. Like, okay, here's a regular drug. Okay, this data isn't strong enough. But for these rare disease patients, check. I mean, what is it? How does that work for a data analysis?
Yeah, no, you're right that it doesn't necessarily mean like, oh, well, if it's rare disease, you know, okay, fine, we just throw everything out the window. I think it's all the same things exist, right? It's like if you know, the sad reality is, you know, we need sufficient power, which requires high sample size. You know, ideally we would want to randomize. Ideally we would want firm endpoints. You know, all these things would be the dream. And the sad thing is you can't necessarily have that if you've got 3 instances. And it is a good question, because it suddenly almost starts pointing to now we just need wider variety of data, and almost earlier the comment on qualitative data or experiences. But at the end of the day, you have a sample size of 3, and there aren't any special statistical techniques that we can use. It's more just that's all we have. But you have to be careful, because yes, of course, there's bias, and you know, it doesn't suddenly make that data better quality just because it's a rare disease. So it's, yeah, my comment was more so on the lines of we have nothing else, but I acknowledge that could also totally mislead you. And, you know, maybe there's some bias in that data of those 3 patients. So.
Yeah. No, I was still triggered about the critique on adding burden, because I think it's fair critique actually. I think not all the burden though will fall upon patients and physicians, right? It's thinking about causal frameworks is not something that the patient should be doing, probably, but that's something that will fall on statisticians or another team. But perhaps it's good to look at ways how to make expanded access less burdensome. So let's look at the Netherlands, for example, or Germany. countries, of course, with also a long history of bioethics, but also quite efficient healthcare systems. They don't have IRB approval in their expanded access request for named patient request. Maybe we should get that out, for example. Or we have here, of course, we have the IRB and the FDA, but as a gatekeeper, but the FDA approves 99% of all requests. So what kind of gatekeeper leaves the gate open, to say it that way? So there may also be other things that we could cut out simply in the expanded access request process to make it less burdensome. But maybe that's a bit too provocative to end the day.
Speaking of burden, coming from the sponsor side, when we start to talk about our sites that do a lot of EAP work with us, start to talk with them about data, you see a little wall go up. And then the next day you get an email from the research office because they want a contract that has a budget, that has overhead, and that's a burden on the sponsor. And we start looking like clinical research if we get a budget with an overhead, and then we get slapped on the wrist because we're not doing expanded access, now we're doing research. The sites don't have the staff, they don't want to do it. The patients are already a little bit burdened, you talked about that. We're just stuck right in the middle of all this. Yes, we want more data, we want better data, but we can't pay for it because if we pay for it, then we're doing research. What's the solution? I mean, I love all
But
the
I
things
don't think
that
that
you
paying for
want.
something makes it research, right? And in the end, if there's value for a sponsor in collecting data, well, then there's a reason to pay for it if there's sufficient value, right?
But if we pay for it, it's not expanded access anymore, it becomes
I
research.
don't think that's regulation, that it says expanded access. You can do it now. Why is that?
Because when our pre-launch teams and our commercial groups start to look at that, it looks like we are coercing physicians to treat their patients with a not yet approved drug and build a base for commercialization for the product.
Yeah, but then it's an issue of like internal SOPs and review, et cetera. But I don't think there's like official in the guidelines that you cannot reimburse someone for data collection. That's
No,
not,
there's a lot of perceptions about it not looking quite right, and also the cost of it to a sponsor. Something that they don't want to incur. They're already giving the drug for free, which is a very costly thing. They have to support staff to operationalize these programs. If you're talking about collecting data at these sites, is somebody going to monitor that data? Then you're paying for that. And then you start looking even more like research. So it's a conundrum. I don't know how to solve it.
what I've, in my experience also was very successful is like getting the physicians themselves on board, right? Making them, I don't know, write up an article or a manuscript, especially in the rare disease space, or facilitate that at least. Of course, that will cost money as well, but there is value in it, right? So if there's value in it, then yeah. And if
now
there's
we
no
do, but
value,
that-
then
but
don't
that-
pay
that's
for it
what
and
you were
don't do it,
talking
right?
About gathering cases together to make, individual cases, individual INDs, and writing manuscripts and putting them all together in a publication. And that's great, and that's what we do. But it's still a lot of work and a lot of, you want really good data to be able to do that. And it just builds. I'll catch you later for that.
Maybe something for over a cocktail. I think.
Yeah, I think I'll end on that with, here, I have one more
Oh,
question.
I just have a really quick comment because I feel, even though I'm not there, I have to defend the gatekeeper comment. It's at 99% because all those requests have already been pre-vetted by the company. The FDA won't entertain it unless there's a letter of authorization from the company. So that's why it's so high.
Yeah, we
It's
should
looking
randomize that,
for
I think.
safety.
Maybe we do half of them with FDA and half of them without FDA and then see what the percentage is.
Well, it'd be interesting. But there is also some record of improvement of protocols after they're reviewed. I think somebody came up with an 11% number where they, commented about how it could be improved in terms of safety and monitoring.
So, but what do you then think of Germany and Netherlands who don't have that? Are they like crazy?
that don't have.
They don't have IRB review. for
Oh, I
example.
wasn't even talking about the IRB.
No,
review.
no, no,
You were
but
talking
whether
about
it's FDA
gatekeeping.
or IRB or like,
Yeah,
get rid of one.
The purpose of the IRB for expanded access is really for the informed consent. They're the only body who's going to review the informed consent. So to ensure, or hopefully ensure, that the informed consent is adequate so that people know that they're getting an investigational product or an investigational device, that's where the IRB comes in. Is it an adequate informed consent? Because they're really the only body.
Right. And I think we just have time for one more question.
Yeah, I think this is a quick one. Someone asked in the slides shown at the start of this session regarding how many submissions included real-world evidence data, did that represent both rare and non-rare disease indications? It seems like there may be a difference between rare and non-rare diseases in that data.
Yeah, yeah. So it's both. So I'm wondering how people could see the difference when I group them all together. But it's both rare. We did it a bit more analysis, I believe, on what use the data was. So whether it was safety or efficacy, or it was pediatrics, for example. And I believe that if you then were to compare non-rare to rare, you'd see that within the rare disease space, it would be higher rates of using it for efficacy and for pediatric labels. But that wasn't in the data in the slide, so.
All right, so I think the theme of this panel, as you can see, is it's complicated, and the burden will always fall on one person in that pathway. And so at the end of the day, you need to think long and hard about the data that you collect, and is it worth whatever additional burden that is placing on that particular individual, as well as think about how you could make that data collected of higher quality. So I think that concludes this session.